Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going a weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. Back with another episode of the Games Memo. This is the Games Memo for Saturday, the 15th of August, 2026. We're going to be talking a few things tonight, a couple new kind of hypotheses, theses, analyses. I did say analysis intentionally. So a few things that I've been noodling through during the week about kind of what the changing landscape is on the gaming market, and so I kind of wanted to talk through a couple of those theories tonight. So my apologies for being late. I moved this show like 3 or 4 times before I finally got situated to go live. And then had a couple technical problems getting the live stream started. So thanks very much for anybody who happens to come through and join me in live chat. I appreciate you. But without much further ado, let's get to it. So a couple of these segments, I did not have as much time to edit the script beforehand, so as we get further on into the show, things may get a little wonky. We may be doing some live edits here, but we will see how it goes. First place I wanted to start is with this news story over on IGN.com. Marvel's Wolverine Limited Edition PS5 console announced, plus physical disc drive covers. Now, this is kind of a little bit of a Trojan horse, a little bit of a MacGuffin, as several of these articles are tonight, because the article itself isn't really what I want to discuss. It's about, either thoughts that I've had about the industry or just interacting with the gaming community, but also how I'm going to, in this specific instance, how I'm going to address or contend with or engage on, interact with several key topics kind of in the gaming conversation right now, and very much so probably, or not in this instance. Thanks so much for people showing up in the live chat. RPG88, thanks very much for coming through. Rachie, interesting how PlayStation only promoted the digital version of the shell. Yeah, I mean, I think it's super interesting kind of what news articles you came across, because the first one, either what news articles are kind of social media posts that you came across first. The first ones that I came across really touted the panels. And it wasn't for quite some time before I realized that, oh no, they're actually selling consoles, not just the panels. And so I don't know that we've seen a collector's edition console this generation. And I definitely know that throughout this generation, I've commented for both Xbox and PlayStation how I kind of lament the disappearance of actual collector's edition consoles. In that, PlayStation's done plates, and then Xbox has done wraps. Neither of which I feel is actually a thing that you really enjoy having as much as the fully constituted product. But let's start with the top of the news article, and then I'll read through kind of some of my thoughts on this. Again, this news article over on IGN by Tom Phillips. PlayStation 5 exclusive Marvel's Wolverine will be accompanied by a limited edition PS5 console bundle, plus cover plates for both digital PS5 consoles and those with disc drives. Available from September 15th alongside Insomniac's new game, the Marvel's Wolverine Limited Edition PS5 Digital Edition bundle and accessories sports a yellow-colored design inspired by Logan's classic suit. But the console and accompanying controller feature the appearance of a striking claw slash, while a roaring Wolverine appears on the console's upper third. By bundle here, Sony appears to be just meaning you get the controller with your console. Despite appearing in pictures, you still don't get the console's vertical stand included. And I actually don't know, again, because like where these things are discussed in various places are very spotty, and the articles are spotty too. I don't know if you actually get the game with this collector's edition, or if the game comes bundled with it, or if you have to buy that separately. Chopper Eric, thanks so much for coming through the chat as well. I like the plates more than the controller. Yeah. So at any rate, to be quite honest, like the collector's edition stuff is not like the central piece that I want to actually talk about. The piece that I'm actually kind of use this to platform off of is getting back to and what I think will be kind of the final wrap up of any dialogue that I have about the whole physical versus digital conversation. RPG88 says probably separate. So yeah, probably. And if the music is too loud, let me know. In my headphones, it's very quiet, almost barely audible. I actually had it cranked up a little bit more in pre-prod, and it was actually on the live stream on the backstage of the live stream. It actually sounded too loud, so I turned it down. So just let me know if it's still too loud. The announcement of Marvel's Wolverine Limited Edition PlayStation 5 actually struck me as pretty cool, and not for the reason you might expect. Sony's announcement that it will stop producing physical game discs for new PlayStation releases beginning in January 2028 has generated an enormous amount of anger. But when I saw the Wolverine console, my first thought wasn't about physical media at all. It reminded me of the hardware collector's editions that used to be much more common. My own PS4 Pro, for example, was the Destiny 2 edition with its distinctive Arctic white finish and matching controller. That kind of hardware felt special precisely because it was more than a set of cosmetic plates. So seeing Sony do a genuine limited edition Wolverine console and then offering matching covers for people who own the add-on disc drive struck me as a smart bit of PlayStation brand alignment. It recognizes the people who are deeply invested in the PlayStation ecosystem, regardless of which version of the hardware they own. In the future, if you want physical, Sony will sell you Teely 3 final record figurine limited controllers. So now, instead of $70, Teely 3 will cost $350. And then RPG says music good. Thanks a lot, RPG. Appreciate it. And that distinction matters because I don't see the Wolverine announcement as some kind of concession of physical media advocates. I also don't see it as a lot of other content creators and influencers and internet gamers see it as an affront or a slap in the face about, for the people advocating for maintenance of digital. It's simply Sony acknowledging that hardware, some of its hardware that is already sold, that albeit the consoles that it has sold that do have those accessories, those attachments of the disc drives. If you bought a PS5 with the detachable disc drive, of course Sony should offer you a matching cover when it creates a collector's edition design. Otherwise, you'd have a beautifully themed console with a giant white disc drive hanging off the side of it. That's not particularly elegant. More broadly, though, I'm not personally conflicted about Sony's decision to move away from physical games. I made that transition with music roughly 2 decades ago, movies and television more than a decade ago, and games years ago. Actually, 20 years ago, in fact, I even gave away my physical PC game collection. I had over 100 physical PC games, and because I saw PC was going all digital, and because again my personal experience was that I'd moved 13 times before I ever bought a house. I had long since gotten to this point where I was like, jewel cases were the first things to go, which went, I think, in 2000 or maybe even the late 90s. I said, I cannot keep packing up and moving all these jewel cases. So I had already transitioned all of my discs to big CD wallets. And so when it came time to move, I would just grab the CD wallets, throw them in a box, and I would go. So I'd long since gotten rid of jewel cases. And when, PC games came out of GameStop and Steam stood up, and that became my primary way of buying games, I had a good friend whose wife was not so pleasant about him buying video games, and so I was like, look, you will be much more served by this physical video game collection than I will, so you can just go ahead and have them. So I packed them all up and I gave them to him, and I moved to all digital. So I've long been out of that game. So I even gave away my physical PC game collection after deciding that it made no sense to spend most of my time acquiring games digitally while also maintaining a separate physical media workflow for the remainder. From my perspective as someone who follows technology beyond just games, this has been the natural direction of media for 2 decades. Sony's decision isn't some shocking rupture with the past. It is another step along the road. It is another step along a road the rest of the entertainment industry has already traveled. So a few of these things I'm laying out is because, I've talked about, how I've been interacting with other gamers, or how I've been, affected by the conversation, but I haven't really talked about my own position on the whole physical versus digital conversation, right? Just as a personal consumer, I've talked a lot about, how I have analyzed or assessed what is going on with the Thalgal plan and lots of other stuff. But I wanted to take some time tonight at the beginning of the show to talk about where I personally sit with the physical versus digital situation, and then also to round up with how I'm going to be treating that conversation from here on out. What I find more interesting is the business data behind that transition. Since Sony's announcement, I've noticed that third-party publishers increasingly highlighting the split between their physical and digital game sales in their financial reporting. So this is one thing that I want people to notice. I haven't heard people pick up on it. If you follow earnings reports and you read the earnings reports as each of them come out from major players in the industry, you will have noticed a very strange trend over the last month, which has been that every major third-party publisher almost every major third-party publisher who had an earnings report is now reporting their digital versus physical split. And not all of them have been doing it in that way so uniformly. Some of them have, not all of them. And I'm talking to Brap earlier this week. He mentioned he went digging in the EA supplementary information and other data available on the investors relations site, and they actually have even more data. They actually break it down per console, what they're selling digitally versus physically. So again, that seems to be a very much people lining up, publishers who put their games on PlayStation, lining up shoulder to shoulder with an understanding and a concurrence of where the industry is going. And so what those numbers consistently show is that digital is vastly larger. That shouldn't really be surprising. Publishers have been telling us for years that digital distribution is where the business is going. If PlayStation is the largest platform for many of those third-party publishers, and those publishers are overwhelmingly selling their games digitally, the logical conclusion is that the bulk of software, the logical conclusion is that the bulk of software consumption on PlayStation is already digital. Whether some of that digital revenue comes from full game purchases, downloadable content, expansions, microtransactions, or digital trading cards is beside the point. So I want to go back to that really quick. There's a lot of the conversation that is around, that includes DLC and it includes microtransactions, and they're baking the numbers. And in my point, from a business perspective, again, my point is because the argument, this is the thing that has been, I don't necessarily know if I would say that it's frustrating, but the problem that I have with the logic, a lot of the problem that I have with the logic is that they're baking the numbers, they're cooking the numbers. It includes this, it doesn't include that, and my feeling is that what you're doing is you're questioning the business. And my feeling is I don't know that you have enough information to question the business. I certainly don't feel like everyone participating in the conversation has the logic or the reasoning to question the business. What you can absolutely say is that I love physical and I don't agree with this decision. And then you should just make that decision and just leave it at that. A part of the problem that I have with the logic is, from a business perspective, who cares? Who cares if the number includes DLC, microtransactions? The point is that the business, the foundational capital of the business that is being transacted for digital goods, less and less for physical goods. And so that is what's driving the decision. It doesn't matter whether it's single unit games or what. It is the fact that the bulk of the business, of the revenue base of the business, is moving to digital. The important question for a business is what portion of its customers are actually using the physical channel, and whether maintaining the infrastructure to support that channel continues to justify the investment. If physical represents a shrinking portion of the business while digital represents the overwhelming majority and continues to grow, it is reasonable for Sony to redirect resources toward the areas producing greater returns. Now, again, I personally don't think my personal analysis has been, it's not solely that the business, whether or not the business is more digital or physical. That is definitely part of it. The tipping point is about there being less growth in aggregate available in the gaming business, and there being more growth available in other sectors. And when you have to make decisions about investment and use of capital resources like real estate, such as the plant in Thalgal, such as the human capital, the resources that are available at that plant, and how you drive different sectors. Right? We constantly make this comparison of Sony to Microsoft, and many people who draw that analogy always talk about how much more powerful Microsoft is and whatever. But again, Sony is a multi-sector business. They have 5, I think, reporting segments. They just sold off Phony. They just sold off Sony Financial, so the financial group is no longer, but they have 5 different business sectors, right? One is their music business, one is their movie business, one is their imaging and sensors business, the 4th is G&S, and I forget what the 5th one is. But just like Microsoft, they have a changing landscape at corporate scale and decisions to make about where they invest resources and where the best investment of resources is that maximizes their ROI and return to shareholders. So in an environment where there is not as much explosive growth in the gaming environment as there used to be, right? 10, 14, 15 years ago, we have structurally moved to a different economic business and business vector at scale. And so one thing that should be considered is that Sony has also been impacted by that and is making different bets on where it needs to put investment. Which brings me to why I'm done talking about the morality of this decision. Because a lot of the discussion around this that's been led or participated in whatever by other content creators, other influencers, members of the gaming community, is this big discussion about the morality of what PlayStation is doing right. And in my opinion, that is not part of the conversation. At least it's not a very large part of my conversation in how a business runs its own business. There's morality when you talk about, are you doing something to human beings? I obviously we shouldn't probably agree with sweatshops, and Nike forcing children to make tennis shoes. So that's a moral decision, right? But beyond those edges of those thresholds, a business, to me personally, has the right to run its business as it sees to run its business, and it's not up to me to try and hold PlayStation, hostage in social media and hold it at digital gunpoint and attempt to force it right to run its business a certain way. There's certainly a legitimate conversation to be had about digital rights, ownership, preservation, and the implications of depending on digital storefronts. If those issues matter to you, I understand that, but I don't think every PlayStation conversation. So this is me personally and me as a gamer, right? I don't personally think that every PlayStation conversation needs to become another referendum on Sony's decision to stop producing new physical discs. The reaction on social media has become so repetitive that it has ceased to be useful to me as a content creator. I cover news. And I say that you guys have heard me say this before, long before this whole physical thing came up. Gamers being angry about something is not news. That is one of my most frustrating things. Right? Headline, so-and-so happens and gamers are angry. Who cares? I don't personally give a crap. Right? That is not the news. The news is the business or the technology, right? Or the creative aspect of video games, and that's what I talk about. I don't talk about, right, gamers being angry as a news article. So people being angry about something is not by itself news. If there's legal action, regulatory action, a meaningful change in Sony's policy or some other development that materially changes the story, then absolutely that is news worth discussing. But yelling at PlayStation on social media isn't going to change the company's business strategy. Literally, people should have come to that understanding by now. Consumers have a much more direct form of influence. They can choose where to spend their money. If you've decided not to buy PlayStation products because of this, that is your choice. Make it, but there's no obligation to turn that choice into a daily campaign. So at a little more basic level, right? What I'm talking about here is if you've ever had one of those friends who, even the friend who says that's what she said, literally everything you say to that person, that is what these environments have become for the last 6 weeks. It's you bring up the most unrelated thing about physical versus digital media about PlayStation, and somebody says, "Oh, well, PlayStation's not doing to me personally, there's a threshold of being passionate about a thing, and then there's a line that you cross to the point of being obsessive. And I'm not interested in having conversations who are obsessed with this thing as a singular thing that's happening. There are still games coming out. We're heading into holiday season. We're heading into big releases. We still have award season coming around the corner. I am personally interested in video games. If, as I've said before, there's gaming and there's collecting, and if collecting is a larger priority to you than gaming, I understand that. I don't hate you. I'm not trying to dissuade you of your opinion or your position, but you're interested in having a different conversation about games than I am personally interested in having. And I don't I don't want to be in circles and discords and conversational circles where there's an effort to hijack every conversation about PlayStation and push it and direct it in this direction. As I've said many times before on this channel for the last few weeks, me personally, if this really burns you up that much, what I would think you would do, what I have done in the past before, is I would deplatform. And yeah, I'd be salty and I'd probably talk about it for a while, but I would very quickly start pivoting into talking about the new thing that I loved and less of the thing that made me shift to this new thing that I loved. So for me and the games memo, that conversation is over. Sony made its decision, gave customers substantial advance notice, and the broader industry data increasingly supports the underlying direction of travel. I don't have a personal need for physical media, and I don't believe endlessly revisiting the argument is going to produce a different outcome. The gaming industry is moving forward, and there are actual games to play, experiences to have, and industry events to cover. That's where I want my attention to go. I'd rather talk about what is happening in games than spend another day cataloging who is angry about something that has already been decided. Unless something genuinely newsworthy happens, I'm moving on. So the other thing I wanted to bring up was, and actually I can't remember who it was in Thrifty's Discord, but someone else brought up this post by Colin Moriarty, and this also kind of frames where I sit and how I think about our relationship with suppliers, and also kind of frames why I'm having this discussion and why I'm moving in this direction. A large part of the problem, I personally believe, in what has unfolded is that people feel like they have a relationship with PlayStation. It's super funny to me that for years, the PlayStation fan base has talked about parasocial relationships that Xbox players have with the Xbox platform and an incessant need to have the Xbox executives always talking to them and communicating with them. I find it super funny that in this instance, one of the most frequent gripes that I've heard is PlayStation has changed how they're talking to us. PlayStation isn't being open or transparent enough, blah, blah, which sounds hugely like what the Xbox fans typically clamor for. So I love this indication by Colin because he's hit a realization that he himself admits that he didn't understand, and that he thinks a lot of other gamers don't understand. It is a thing that I feel like I firmly understand, which is that you have one relationship as a buyer with a supplier, and that is for you to either purchase their goods or not purchase their goods. We constantly have this discussion, and I get it. PR is a thing, marketing is a thing, but I don't know. I think part of the problem is people who feel like they have a relationship with a supplier is what gets people into vendor lock-in. That's why people refuse to shift phone platforms. You used to have this funny saying in the mobile review circles, which is that life is too short to have a bad phone. To me personally, if you have a bad phone and you're not enjoying the experience, I'll be damned if I'm going to spend 2 years on that handheld device occupying a large part of my life rather than move on. If it's associated with the platform that you're on, then you need to just shift platforms. But my point is that there's this feeling that people have a relationship with suppliers. And my personal feeling has always been my single relationship with a supplier as a buyer is I can either buy their goods or not. We constantly have this discussion about approval. And I'm also going to throw some shade because I think I hear a lot of PlayStation people say, well, the PlayStation community holds PlayStation accountable. Well, you're not holding a company accountable if you're still spending goods. I don't really want to hear it. That's an excuse, quite frankly. When PlayStation does something we don't like, we run to social media and we yell and we scream about it. Who cares? And if you don't get it that now they're seeing you yelling and screaming and they're directly saying to your face, we don't care. That has been the case for forever. They don't care. People have convinced themselves that the companies do. The companies care about where the spend is. Their objective, again, the legal fiduciary requirement for a C-suite officer doesn't say anything in their contract that they sign up to about keep people happy on social media. What it says is maximum return on investment to shareholders. And so your relationship, again, with a corporation is buy their thing or don't buy their thing. If this is upsetting you, you should not buy their thing. Period. Tons of sturm and drang about everything under the sun other than not buying the thing. And I've just had it. Like, you guys can have that conversation. I'm not having it. Buy the thing, don't buy the thing, and then move on. Because like obsessing over not buying the thing is also just not, this is not healthy. This is not well adjusted. I'm just going to be frank. Okay, let me check the chat. Sorry, this is part of the problem is my controls are backwards here, sorry. I don't know what the conversation is in the chat about the Epstein files. Okay, so that, like, literally that's where I'm gonna leave it off. Like, you know, as people continue to be angry and people continue to have a problem with it, I'm just gonna let that go. Again, if something newsworthy and objective happens, I'll absolutely discuss it on the show. Tonight's also going to be a long show, by the way. We are not getting out of here in an hour, so because I put together too much stuff. There's something I wanted to check, and now I can't even remember what it is. So let's go on to the next news story. Hey, Def Lloyd, thanks so much for coming through. Aaron Walsh, also thanks so much for coming through. Next news story, UK charts. Resident Evil Requiem gobbles a herb and is back on top. This news story over on Nintendo Life by Ollie Reynolds. And I'm going to grab a drink and then we'll get right back to it. Okay, so I'm going to leave the chart up on the screen. I'm not going to go through the, maybe I will. The latest UK box charts data is in. It's fairly quiet. It's a fairly quiet week with no major entries for the Switch 1 and 2. PS5 and PC got Marvel Tokon Fighting Souls, which debuts at number 6, while Game Freak's Beast of Reincarnation launched on PS5, PC, and Xbox landing at number 5. Meanwhile, Capcom's Resident Evil Requiem saw a nice boost in sales to jump all the way up to number 1, beating Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced and Pokemon Pocopia. A quick search only reveals the outlets are selling Requiem at roughly £10 less than the suggested retail price, and we're not seeing any major discounts that could explain the bump in sales. It's also worth noting that the Switch 2 version of Requiem sold the least amount of copies, making up 5% of the overall platform split. Here's the remainder of the top 40 with platform breakdowns for games available on Switch and Switch 2, so I'll leave that up on screen. So my analysis, there wasn't a major new release for release competing for the top spot in the UK last week, so seeing Resident Evil Requiem return to number 1 could easily be dismissed as a product of a soft release slate. I think that would miss the more interesting point. Yes, the absence of a major new release created an opportunity, but what filled that vacuum is still useful data. Resident Evil Requiem was competing against other recent releases and games with substantial marketing behind them, and it came out on top. That is another indication that Capcom has a game with genuine staying power, and another feather in the cap of a company that is having a pretty exceptional, strong year. When a game that has already been on the market can rise back to the top in a week without a major new release, it tells us something about what consumers actually want to buy when the newest shiny thing isn't dominating the conversation. And again, I think that's slightly incorrect in the scripting. There were new releases last week, and despite them being new, Marvel Tokon Fighting Souls, Beast of Reincarnation, we still had Resident Evil Requiem land at the top on the UK charts. But the more interesting story in this week's chart may actually be Nintendo. 4 of the UK's top 10 best-selling box games were Nintendo titles: Pokemon Pocopia, Tomodachi Life, Living the Dream, Splatoon Raiders, and Mario Kart World. Now, the UK is generally a good market for Nintendo. It is something that is a little regionally, there's strong regional affinity for the Nintendo platform in Britain, especially for physical. That's a remarkably strong showing for Switch 2, particularly because Mario Kart World continues to sell well without simply being bundled with the console. It also pushes back against the recurring narrative that the game isn't selling. More broadly, what we're seeing is Nintendo increasingly occupying the role that Xbox once occupied in a very different generation. A platform where first-party software has an unusually broad reach across the install base. A major Nintendo release isn't necessarily serving a narrow segment of its audience. A substantial portion of Nintendo owners are interested in Nintendo's biggest games. That makes the platform's software sales particularly impressive. And so what I mean by that may not necessarily be as intuitive the way that I wrote it up. I used to characterize the difference between the PlayStation platform and the Xbox platform as, and again, this is used to, so let's go back, right? The past two generations, not this generation necessarily. I always talked about how PlayStation had a wider variety and more first-party titles that served different people who were looking for different stories. But none of those games sold in really big numbers. So let's go pre-God of War 2018. I don't necessarily believe that PlayStation first-party titles would sell to a huge swath of the user install base. Whereas on Xbox, when a Halo title would come out, everybody would go and play Halo. When Gears would come out, everybody would go and play Gears. Now, again, this is also a discussion about pre-Game Pass, right? And so what I'm saying here is that Nintendo is also entering the space and is now becoming the sole one in the space where when they launch a first-party title, and this has always gone on Nintendo, it was a problem in the whole Nintendo Wii era. That's why third-party support dried up, because third parties got tired of putting their games on Nintendo platforms only to just have their lunch eaten by any random Nintendo first-party game that came along, even if it wasn't that good. But the difference that I'm describing here is that now Nintendo is kind of the only one in the space that well has essentially run entirely dry from the Xbox perspective, to the point where it kind of doesn't matter now how frequently PlayStation is putting out first-party titles, because those first-party titles are still an allure for people when they select what platform they're buying. And so now how well they sell at scale in terms of attach rate isn't as big a deal, which is also why I poo-poo on a lot of content creators that I hear say, you know, when PlayStation decided to pull its games off of PC, that now there needed to be like this extinction level, like hyper focus on the attach rate of a PlayStation first party title to the console. And I'm like, I don't think so. I think what PlayStation cares about is that people buy more PlayStation consoles than they buy Xbox. And so they make first-party titles to draw that swing, but I don't necessarily know at scale that they are as wrapped around the axle about every single first-party title, right, selling God of War numbers, because again, God of War was an aberration and a swing in what we had historically seen on the PlayStation platform before then. The other piece of the story is third-party support. I don't think it is useful to talk about Switch 2 achieving technical parity with PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series consoles. It obviously isn't about identical hardware performance, but it is increasingly becoming a platform of parity in a different and more important sense. Games are showing up there. Resident Evil Requiem is there. Assassin's Creed Shadows is there. More third-party games are arriving either concurrently or within a relatively narrow window, with exceptions such as 007 First Light demonstrating that transition isn't going to happen uniformly. And that's a very minor, like 007 is coming to Switch 2, but it's not day and date. But I don't think day and date matters as much if the windows are close, right, within a few months of each other. Last generation, the Switch was an enormous Nintendo first-party platform, but mainstream AAA third-party releases were frequently afterthoughts, older games, remasters, ports of games that had already appeared elsewhere. Switch 2 is beginning, right, like Switch last generation was kind of the nostalgia machine in a lot of ways. Older third-party games that had never appeared on a Nintendo platform started showing up on a Nintendo platform as a port, as a remaster, as a re-release, whatever. And what you're seeing more and more this generation is that they're not like 10-year-old games showing up on Switch 2 for the first time, right? They are like more and more publishers are making the decision, when we release this game, we are also going to release it on PlayStation. On Nintendo. So Switch AAA third parties were frequently mainstream AAA third party releases were frequently afterthoughts, older games, remasters, reports of games that had already appeared elsewhere. Switch 2 is beginning to change that perception. The more major third party games that arrive on the platform, the more consumers will see it not simply as the Nintendo console, but as a legitimate place to play the broader industry's biggest games. And so what I mean by that is like a shift, right, in value prop and positioning of the Switch 2 on the market. Whereas Nintendo platforms have historically been like you're on Nintendo almost solely to play the Nintendo games. Now that platform has a broader swath of reach because new games that are in the zeitgeist, right, that are part of the FOMO, are showing up on Switch 2 at virtually the same time as they're showing up on other platforms. And that makes a huge difference because of this next piece that I want to go into. That could become particularly significant because of the price equation. There was plenty of Sturm and Drang around Nintendo's decision to launch Switch 2 at $449, and now we're looking at a console that, depending on which competing models you're comparing, can be the least expensive entry point into the current generation console gaming, and that's even at $499. I think the 512 gigabyte like Series S is the same price, but Switch has been eating the Series S's lunch right since 2017 or 2020, whenever the Series S came out. If Nintendo can pair that lower entry price with an increasingly credible library of mainstream third-party games to go along with the Nintendo first-party stuff, the value proposition starts to look very different from the one people were debating at launch. Imagine a consumer who wants access to the major games that doesn't want to spend several $100s more on a competing console, in some cases almost twice as much. If those games are available on Switch 2, perhaps not always day and date, but increasingly within a 90-day window, Nintendo has a compelling value proposition. The question isn't whether Switch 2 can technically compete with PlayStation 5 or Xbox. It's whether consumers perceive it as a console where the games they want to play are available. So the question of performance used to be a very big deal and becomes a very big deal when the price differential isn't that much. But when performance starts to become a thing that people literally can't afford, performance starts to go out the window as a value prop or an argument. What becomes more of a discussion, or what becomes a bigger value prop for the least expensive console on the market, is the availability of a common gaming library. And the more and more people start to perceive that that gaming library is common, that it is either one-to-one or that the delta is so imperceptible, it starts to shift that value proposition. And you start to potentially have more and more people looking at the Nintendo as the entry platform into gaming. And then it'll be a matter, like, once they root there, then it's going to become a matter of, like, do they ever, like, transition up? So in many other markets, we have a thing where, you know, new gamers coming into the market come in at the inexpensive end and then swim upwards. So that is a thing that I think could be happening as this pricing situation continues. So that's the trend I'll be watching. I don't think this week's UK chart fundamentally changes how I cover games or assess games or analyze games, nor do I think we should overinterpret a single week's worth of data. This isn't a story about the physical versus digital debate either. The UK chart data is specifically rooted in boxed retail sales, while Nintendo's own financial reporting shows that its business is also already shifting towards digital, with roughly 62% of software sales digital versus 38% physical in its latest reporting. I think their actual reporting was something like 60.1 or 62.1 and like 38 points. I don't know. The important takeaway here is simpler. Switch 2 is becoming increasingly anchored in the broader console ecosystem. Resident Evil Requiem returning to number one is evidence that Capcom has built a game with legs, but 4 Nintendo titles also in the top 10, and the growing presence of major third-party releases that are also in these top charts with sales on Switch 2 may ultimately tell us more about where Nintendo's new console fits in the market. The Switch 2 is stretching its legs, and the industry is starting to treat it less like a Nintendo sidecar and more like one of the places where games happen. So a lot of the discussion around like Nintendo, some people I disagree with, some people who are good friends of mine, good fellow content creators, very like-minded, they've always felt much more strongly that, Nintendo is part of the market too. Like, they are competing. Like, it's not like this effort to like separate Nintendo and say that they're, yes. But the point is that the reasons people buy the platform are still in discrete buckets, right? They're not the same and they're not common. And the more those consoles start to sit in buckets that look alike and alike and alike, the more the value prop shifts, and the more the value prop gets to, okay, a lot of these things offer the same content, which one is the cheapest, which one is the least expensive way for me to play that game. And then, as we see, the continuing rise of the handhelds, and again, I'm not a handheld prophet. Like, I don't imagine like everybody's going to, shifting to gaming like more conveniently on handhelds, but it's not a zero impact, right, dynamic on the market either. All right, let's go ahead and catch up with chat before we move on to the next news story. So Chopper Eric says, it's been a long ride with PlayStation. I've decided to keep buying the thing until such a time as it no longer has anything to offer me. After that, I'll still have the older things I can enjoy. The problem with the Switch 2 is we are only a year from it being 2 generations behind in performance. Yes. And I mean, the thing I would offer as consideration, Eric, is, or Aaron, is that was also the case with the Switch 1, and yet the Switch 1 continued to sell right to the tune of 150 million units. So, and I think the difference then was that you definitely had games that couldn't go to Switch 1, and you had games that even if they could go to Switch 1, like the performance was so abysmal that it wasn't worth it, and you had so many publishers deciding that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. And what I'm saying is I don't think that trend will continue for the entirety of this generation, that you'll get much longer legs out of the Switch 2 being able to accommodate some of those third-party titles that decide, yes, the juice is worth the squeeze to put that game on Switch 2, day and date, or within, a small number of months of them putting it on other platforms, particularly as you see the decline, the further decline of Xbox, and as the other consoles, right, continue to become more expensive. Okay, let me grab a drink, and then we will get into one of the meatier topics for tonight. Okay, so I've got this news article up basically just as window dressing. I'm not reading it, and this is not what I'm covering. The main thing I want to talk about now is this concept of the post three-party console market, why it is breaking apart, how it will look, and how it will operate. So I agree with the premise that we are entering a post three-party console market, and I don't think there is one single event responsible for getting us here. This is a perfect storm created by several market dynamics converging at once. The cost of building hardware has risen dramatically, while the socioeconomic composition of the consumer market has changed in ways that complicate the traditional laws of supply and demand. In particular, specifically when we're talking about luxury markets, right, where often operate with slightly different dynamics than the base rules of the laws of economics. In the United States, the traditional middle-class income band is shrinking, while the number of higher-income households is growing, meaning there is still a significant pool of consumers capable of absorbing higher hardware prices. This is why things have continued to sell this generation, despite the rising prices that we see. And again, as I referred to before, Matt Piscatella has admitted that this is a dynamic that he misread and didn't understand soon enough, and that's part of the reason why some of his comments and reads on the business have been incorrect. At the same time, Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo have each arrived at very different conclusions about how they can best compete. Nintendo decided that competing on hardware power wasn't its path forward. Microsoft concluded that competing primarily through exclusive software wasn't working. Sony has largely retained the traditional premium console strategy, while simultaneously looking for new growth through areas such as live service games. Those divergent strategies, combined with changing economics, have created an event horizon for the traditional three-way console market. Microsoft is probably the clearest example of just how radically the old model has changed. After years of strategic whiplash, Xbox appears to be settling into a hybrid model rather than pursuing one singular identity. There will still be an Xbox console business, but I expect that hardware business to become a relatively small nucleus rather than the center of the entire company. Around that nucleus, so right, despite the comments that 80% of our business is on console, blah 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 blah. My assessment is like we're going to talk a lot about how the Xbox executives say a lot of things that don't pass the smell test. In fact, I wrote an article recently that says like this notion of a turnaround doesn't pass the smell test. But I think there are some objective realities that tell different stories. Around that nucleus will be a blue-chip software business increasingly focused on established tentpole franchises: Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, Fallout, Elder Scrolls, Halo, Gears of War, Forza Horizon, and the other major intellectual properties that can reliably attract large audiences. Microsoft is effectively adopting much of the Activision Blizzard philosophy: minimize content risk and concentrate resources on the franchises that have already demonstrated enormous demand. At the same time, Microsoft will continue operating a services business encompassing Game Pass, cloud gaming, and its broader developed and cloud infrastructure business. And critically, Xbox will increasingly function as a third-party publisher, putting some of its games on competing platforms rather than treating every first-party release as a reason to buy Xbox hardware. So, and this dovetails with some of the things that we've heard, that one of the ripple effects that happened from the Activision Blizzard acquisition was that a lot of people internally at Microsoft looked at Activision and said, Xbox can't seem to get its act together, but you guys over at Activision Blizzard have apparently figured some things out. We want some of what you guys have. And so a lot of the Activision Blizzard executives have filtered over into the Xbox chain of command. And a lot of them are driving these focuses, hyper focuses on only the big stuff, right? That last piece fundamentally changes the economics of the console war. Xbox cannot realistically ignore PlayStation. PlayStation currently commands the largest share of the combined console and PC gaming market. And the scale of that audience makes it too valuable for Microsoft to simply walk away from. If Xbox represents roughly 10% of the combined console and PC install base, there's no plausible scenario in which making every game exclusive suddenly transforms that 10% into something approaching the 30% of console market revenue share that PlayStation owns, right? So the combined console and PC gaming market runs north of 90 billion, 92 billion, right? What have you, depending on the reporting year. PlayStation makes 30 billion. So a third of that revenue is generated by PlayStation. Microsoft can continue selling consoles and maintaining exclusive games for some releases while simultaneously publishing other games on PlayStation and PC. Those strategies aren't necessarily contradictory anymore. They're components of the same hybrid model. The result is that a PlayStation owner increasingly has access not only to virtually the entire traditional third-party software market and Sony's own first-party catalog, but also to a growing selection of Microsoft software. Now, growing in just in terms of like additional titles being added, I think, I don't think, we're now in an era where the entirety of the Microsoft portfolio, of the Xbox portfolio, isn't going over to PlayStation. Some games will be held exclusive, but at the end of the day, you still get over time a compiling number of Xbox titles that wind up on the PlayStation catalog. That makes the traditional rationale for buying an Xbox increasingly difficult to sustain. Nintendo, meanwhile, is pursuing a fundamentally different path. It has spent years demonstrating that it doesn't need to win the hardware performance race to create an enormously successful platform. What is particularly interesting now is that Switch 2 is increasingly becoming a credible home for mainstream third-party software as well, like we talked about in the last section. The distinction is important. I'm not talking about technical parity with PlayStation or Xbox. I'm talking about platform parity. The idea that major games increasingly show up on Nintendo's hardware and that consumers can reasonably view Switch 2 as one of the places where the broader gaming industry happens. That gives Nintendo a very different position from the one it occupied for much of the Switch generation, when it was primarily a destination for Nintendo's first-party games, older releases, and ports. If Nintendo can combine its unusually powerful first-party software with a growing library of major third-party games, it has a compelling proposition, particularly as its hardware becomes the lower-cost entry point into current generation console gaming. So again, a lot of that, right, is a repeat from last section, but I'm trying to paint out where each of these three platform competitors winds up. And that leaves us with what I think is the most important element of the post-three-party market. The platform is no longer really the box. When I talk about a platform, I'm talking about an investment choice that includes hardware, software purchased through that hardware's tightly coupled digital storefront, and the services consumed through it. Under that definition, I think there are really only two relevant platforms emerging from this transition: PlayStation and Nintendo. Xbox hardware can continue to exist and can continue to have an audience, but I expect its hardware footprint eventually to become relatively insignificant, meaning more insignificant than it already is. That doesn't necessarily make Xbox irrelevant, because Microsoft's software and services business can remain enormous. But like one of the things, again, as much as I comment on Xbox's performance, we do have to continue to keep in mind that they make right north of $20 billion a year in the industry. So Xbox and PlayStation combined make more than 50% of the overall revenue take of the combined PC and console gaming market each year. But consider Steam. Its hardware footprint is tiny, right? And in fact, just a few years ago, its hardware footprint was zero because it didn't do hardware. But right now it's tiny, yet Steam remains one of the most important platforms in gaming because its software footprint is enormous. Xbox could occupy a somewhat analogous position, except with a much smaller software storefront footprint than Steam. In a predominantly digital gaming future, the real crown jewel isn't the piece of hardware sitting underneath your television, it's the digital storefront and the audience attached to it. I don't think that means the digital storefront becomes an impervious moat, however. As consoles move increasingly toward an all-digital model, I expect regulators to look at console storefronts in much the same way they're looking at Apple and Google's mobile storefronts. The argument will increasingly become that platform owners should not be able to dictate that every piece of software sold on their hardware must flow through their own store while taking a substantial share of the revenue. I could eventually see a future in which, for example, you can purchase an Ubisoft game for PlayStation through an Ubisoft Connect application running on PlayStation hardware, much as you can do today on PC. That would loosen the platform owner's grip and allow some revenue to leak away from the central storefront, but I don't think it would destroy the business and become catastrophic. The platform owners would still control enormous audiences in the hardware environments those audiences use. Other revenue streams would have to become more important, but the digital storefront will remain extraordinarily valuable. So the console war isn't simply ending, it's being transformed. The companies that once competed primarily to sell you a box are increasingly competing to own the relationship between you, your games, your services, and the digital marketplace through which you consume them. So again, going back to that buyer-supplier relationship, that is being transformed from a piece of hardware. And again, today, Nintendo and PlayStation, the digital storefront is still tightly coupled to you purchasing the hardware. But when you have the possibility that you are going to have other procurement paths, other delivery paths to get software onto that hardware, then the PlayStation storefront or the Xbox storefront, right, that landscape starts to change. Hey, Warren, sorry. I don't know why I said sorry. Thanks so much for joining me in the chat. I appreciate you showing up. Let me take another drink and then let's move on to talk about Geoff Keighley and the Game Awards in GTA 6. We have some more to talk about that post three-party console market as we swing around at the end here to talk more so directly about some things going on over at Xbox. Yeah, well, I don't know why in the world I said I'm sorry. I don't know if I saw that word somewhere on my screen as I turned to look at the chat, but whatever. Thanks so much for coming through. I appreciate you. So this next news story, again, the GTA 6 article that's up on the screen is just window dressing. What I really want to talk about is, will he change the date? Keighley, the Game Awards, and GTA 6. So I have changed my mind about how awards relevant Grand Theft Auto 6 is. I originally viewed GTA 6 primarily through the lens of its enormous commercial success and cultural impact, but going back through the awards history of the series changed that assessment. Since GTA 3, the series has repeatedly been recognized by major awards organizations. GTA 3 won the Golden Joystick and GDC awards. Vice City won the Golden Joystick and received nominations for BAFTA, DICE, and GDC. San Andreas won the Golden Joystick and was nominated at DICE, BAFTA, and GDC. GTA 4 won Game of the Year at both the Spike Awards and DICE. The Spike Awards were the precursor to the TGAs. And GTA 5 won the Golden Joystick and Spike Awards while receiving nominations for DICE, GDC, and BAFTA. The Golden Joystick record is particularly significant because it is determined by player voting, and GTA has won essentially every Golden Joystick for which it has been eligible except for GTA 4. That suggests something I had previously underestimated. GTA isn't merely a commercial phenomenon that everyone feels compelled to play. There's genuine sustained recognition for the series across both players and industry facing awards juries from a critical and creative standpoint. So I will admit, I have undersold, right, the impact of GTA 6 as simply being commercial, simply being a trend, a fad, something that people just like, I used to think of it as kind of the Levi's jeans of gaming, right? It's just something that people felt to go out and buy, whether they played it or not, right? It was just following the crowd. I will admit, going back and looking through the history of the awards, that I was incorrect in that assessment. That history makes the November 19th launch of GTA 6 particularly interesting because it lands essentially on top of the Game Awards eligibility window. The natural reaction has been to ask whether Geoff Keighley should move the cutoff so GTA 6 can be properly considered for the 2026 show. I don't think he will, and I don't think he should. The eligibility cutoff isn't simply an arbitrary line intended to prevent a game from being released too late for voters to play it. The Game Awards is an enormous live production that has to be planned, scripted, sequenced well in advance. Nominees have to be determined, awards presentations have to be arranged, developers and publishers have to be contacted, celebrities and presenters have to be scheduled and flown in, trailers and announcements have to be prepared, and the entire show has to be rehearsed and produced. The ceremony itself cannot simply move because one game arrives at the last possible moment. The 2026 Game Awards are currently scheduled for December 10th, leaving a fixed production window that has to accommodate all of those moving pieces. So in this discussion, right, there are things that can move and there are things that can't. The December 10th date can't move. That production crew has to put together an award show that airs on December 10th, come hell or high water, no matter what. So when you talk about moving the date, the people who are impacted by that are people that wind up getting crunched against an immovable target, right? So jurors get crunched, the production crew gets crunched, other gamers, other games developers, all the people who are attending the ceremony get crunched. So this notion of like, should you move the date because GTA 6 is so big, the number of people who get negatively impacted by such a move is far greater than is simply compensated for by the recognition of GTA 6. More importantly, moving the cutoff for GTA 6 would create a precedent that the Game Awards would have to deal with every year thereafter. If the cutoff is moved because GTA is too important to exclude, what happens the next time another publisher releases a game just after the deadline that its fans consider equally important? Now, when I say that, I'm not saying that the fans are rational, right? That's the first thing. But if Keighley moves the date for GTA 6, every rabid fandom for any game that lands near that cutoff date and the date isn't moved is going to crash out, right? If a Kingdom Hearts game comes out, if a Final Fantasy game comes out, if a Bethesda game comes out, if a Forza game comes out, right? These entrenched, fiercely loyal communities are going to crash out and say, you moved it for GTA 6, this series is just as relevant or more relevant or whatever, right? Because again, in my assessment that GTA 6 wasn't as artistically as important as it is commercially, there will be other people who feel that way, and there will be other people who feel that their game is disenfranchised. But again, I go back to this date isn't there for, right, the date's not there. I mean, the date is there to give the maximum amount of time theoretically, right, for games to come out, but the hard stop on the date is because it provides the minimum amount of time or the reasonable amount of time for the production crew to put that show together and for all the logistics to be coordinated once all the nominees are known. The argument that nothing is bigger than GTA may be true commercially, but award systems cannot function by renegotiating their rules every time a particularly important game arrives late. And moving the cutoff would not simply create more work for the production team, it would also potentially squeeze other games out of nominations in categories where GTA 6 would occupy a slot, despite having had almost no time to be evaluated by the voting body. That is especially relevant this year because a large number of games have clustered into September and October after waiting for GTA 6's release date to be established. The jury already has an enormous amount of material to play before ballots are finalized. The Game Awards' voting process has historically required nominations to be determined before the ceremony, and games that fall outside the eligibility window are generally pushed into the following year's consideration, right? So, again, just to walk the timeline, right? GTA 6 comes out on November 19th. the cutoff date for the TGAs is typically the third Friday of November. This year that falls on November 20th. So what you're saying is that, I mean, without moving the date, what you're saying is GTA 6 is going to come out on November 19th. There's no way in the world people are going to play it in 24 hours, right? Enough to reasonably, right, vote ethically to nominate it. The rumor right now is that Rockstar is not sending out review codes for this game. So people aren't, like, the reviewers are not getting access to this game early, right, on their own. The word right now is any pre-release play is going to be held at these boot camps at local Rockstar locations. So as far as I know, and I didn't pull the thread on all the Rockstar locations, but the major Rockstar locations that I know about are in the US and in the UK. So there are some people who are going to get to play the game there at those boot camps. But obviously, when you talk about those logistics, like everybody in, like, there are 150 media outlets that vote in the TGAs. That includes outlets in the Middle East, right? And so people well outside the zone of it being logistically reasonable to get to these sites. So every media person, right, is not going to get access to this game before release. The vast majority at scale of people who will need to render a vote or submit a nomination for this game are not going to get access to this game until November 19th. So that, at face value, like, makes it a pretty impossible situation, right, for GTA 6 to really be, you know, again, if people are, like, being ethical, to be in the conversation for the Game Awards. Again, without Keighley moving the date. And if Keighley moves the date, he impinges the amount of time that his production crew has to get the ceremony ready. So, but here's where GTA 6 really does become an exception. I think it has enough cultural weight to survive missing the 2026 award cycle in a way that most games simply cannot. Normally, a game that arrives in late November or December and misses the cutoff, and I would even say January of the following calendar year, is effectively forgotten by the following year's awards. Recency bias is real, and the next year's releases quickly establish a new conversation. GTA 6 is different. I don't think it needs to be nominated for Game of the Year in the 2026 Game Awards, and I don't even think it necessarily needs to appear at the ceremony at all. If the game is as significant as its predecessors have been, it will remain part of the awards conversation in 2027. I can see it receiving nominations for genre, technical, and artistic categories, even though I doubt it ultimately makes the Game of the Year in 2027, because 2027 is already shaping up to have a very strong collection of narrative-driven games competing for those top spots. GTA 6 has the aura necessary to break the normal late release forgetting cycle, but that doesn't mean the rules of the 2026 awards need to be rewritten for it. And that's really the point that gets lost when people argue that the Game Awards should simply move the cutoff. The Game Awards is important, but it is not the only major awards institution in gaming. And it isn't really the equivalent of the Oscars. Often, and I've been guilty of it too. To talk about the TGAs as the Oscars of gaming, which I stopped doing several years ago because I realized I was wrong. The broader awards pantheon includes the Golden Joysticks, the GDC Awards, BAFTA, DICE, and the Game Awards. I feel like I'm missing one there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, that's all 5. With each serving a somewhat different audience and purpose. The Game Awards has an especially powerful commercial role because it combines awards with major announcements, trailers, and a massive audience arriving at the end of the year. It celebrates the work developers have done throughout the year while also helping establish the next year's gaming conversation. GTA 6 doesn't need that marketing assistance. Everyone already knows it exists. The games that benefit most from the exposure are the other games competing for attention, the ones that deserve their moment to be discovered and celebrated. Moving the cutoff to squeeze GTA 6 into the 2026 show would therefore solve a problem that GTA 6 doesn't actually have, while creating problems for the production team, the voting jury, and other games. GTA 6 may be big enough to transcend the normal awards calendar, but I don't think it's big enough to justify breaking it. So my personal big problem is, so a lot of this is about why I don't think Keighley will move the date, but more emphatically, I don't feel that the date should be moved. Because if you move the date, right, to squeeze GTA 6 in, you squeeze other games out, right? It's a finite capacity. It's a finite amount of time for the award show. If you have GTA 6 coming up on stage a ton, right? And my feeling is, GTA 6 doesn't need it. Rockstar doesn't need it. They're going to get plenty of accolades. They are also going to make it in time for plenty of the other award shows, right? They're going to miss the Golden Joystick this year, and they're going to miss the TGAs, but they still have DICE, BAFTA, and GDC. So, and again, the thing that happens in the Game Awards is the Game Awards has this commercial dynamic where part of the purpose it serves is to remind everyone of all the games that have come out earlier in the year. And like, I'm just going to be quite honest, like, coincides with, right, the rolling into Black Friday, coincides with holiday sales, and tries to move those games back to the right. Remember, Steam has a huge, like, most of the storefronts, in fact, I think all of the storefronts, all the major digital storefronts have these events where they, like, when the nominees get announced, all their games go up on sale, right? While the Game Awards is going on, all the games are on sale again. And so it has this massive commercial import and dynamic on the market. And my feeling is GTA 6 does not do that. Do you think GTA 6 is going to go on sale because it gets nominated? Do you think it's going to be in the Steam sale, right? In the Steam TGA sale? No, it's not. And so it doesn't need it. It doesn't need the marketing opportunity. It doesn't need to occupy, it doesn't need to suck all the air out of the room. It doesn't need to occupy the airtime. Other games do. Other games are struggling to sell. Other developers are struggling to be recognized. I think not only is it, it sets a bad precedent to move it, but it actually, to a certain extent, and again, I try to, not talk a lot about altruism and morality, but it's a bad call, in my opinion. It's a disservice to other games that, quite frankly, deserve their time to occupy the conversation. So let GTA 6 have its time in the sun after it's been on the market a year. It's not coming to PC yet. The GTA Online, whatever it's going to be that goes along with this thing, we're going to have plenty of time to discuss GTA 6. We're going to have plenty of time to see Rockstar and the developers up on stage. We're going to have plenty of time for GTA 6 to, again, occupy all the airtime, suck all the air out of the room. Great Scott, it already has. I don't think that it needs to have everyone else shouldered aside who has also put in a ton of work, who has also tried to make their games great, who has also tried to give people something that they enjoy, just to satisfy some political agenda that GTA 6 needs to be at the award show. It doesn't need it, and we don't need it as gamers. So Chopper Eric says, multiple storefronts on your console sounds about as fun as it is on your PC. What a wonderful future to look forward to. Yeah, and Chopper Eric, I'm not talking about multiple launchers, right? I'm simply talking about there being an access point, like a tile or an app, for you to go and make a non-store purchase, right? Which is what Google and Apple are being compelled to do now, so that people aren't forced, right? Part of the conversation, and again, I'm siding with the people arguing for physical media, because half the argument is that, once PlayStation goes all digital, they're going to be able to force you to buy from their digital storefront. It will then be a monopoly in other people's terms. This contention that games aren't going to go on sale, when I'm like, games go on crap tons of sales on digital storefronts now. I don't know why that would change, because the companies still need to make money, and demand increases when you lower prices. So at any rate, but I think there becomes an abusive level of power and an unevenly handed level of power between suppliers and buyers when a platform owner can be the sole proprietor of the digital delivery method for you to receive software on that platform. In the past, I really admit I was a proponent of that for both Google and Apple. I kind of understood their side, but I kind of feel like, look, we have all, from a regulatory perspective, from a legal perspective, from a consumer perspective, we have all given them that grace and that time in the sun. 20 years of Apple being the sole proprietor of getting software onto an iPhone. I think maybe there's a strong argument that 20 years is enough, right? And we should be looking at enabling other models to benefit other methods of competition. Let's see what else the chat has had to say. As far as GTA 6 goes, if it's up for awards this year or next, I don't see it being forgotten about and snubbed for any awards it should be considered for. It has to be considered for the following year. So I think you're agreeing with me, Eric. Yeah. What I'm saying is like, if it doesn't make the eligibility cutoff for consideration this year, I don't think it's going to be hurting next year. I think it'll be just fine. I think people will remember GTA and will nominate it for several awards next year. Forza Horizon 5 was said to have missed out in 2021, but really it was just not given a GOTY nom. It got another nom. People complained earlier. Yeah, I mean, I half agree with you, Wara. I do think it didn't make it in time. Like, I think it's objectively true that it didn't make it in time for people to have played it and given it sufficient consideration. That being said, even if it had been delivered earlier, I don't think people would have played it enough and given it sufficient consideration, because the fact of the matter is that what rules the zeitgeist primarily at award shows and at the TGAs is narrative-driven games, particularly of high production quality and high cinematic value. And then we kind of let indies in, like, regardless of that, based primarily on gameplay mechanics. But when we talk about the Game of the Year nomination, that's mostly like the things that have like the strongest story. Or, and I mean Souls games, right, tend to make it in artistically and for game mechanics, regardless of like the depth of story. But my point is Forza Horizon was never going to be nominated for Game of the Year anyway. It did arrive late, but there was, again, that's another point where there's no need to move the date because it wouldn't have mattered anyway. And so moving the date would have just made things painful for tons of other people. And that's kind of a part of the main part of this story is, we need to open up the aperture from this discussion and not consider simply its impact to the sole developer, right, that we're arguing for the date to be moved, right, and recognize that, well, it benefits that developer, but it sure as hell negatively impacts tons of other people. Yeah, unless there's a very threatening NDA with a very hand-picked group of reviewers. Yeah. I mean, Rockstar has to decide how they're letting people go hands-on. Although I will say, right, the threatening NDA, I don't know if people know this, but like the way Nintendo used to do reviews is they used to show up at your media outlet with a handcuffed to a suitcase, and then you'd go into a locked room and play the game for a limited period of time, and you were not allowed to bring paper or other stuff into the room. You weren't allowed to have other people in the room, just the reviewer, and then the escort, right, for the game packed everything up and then left. Any other game would get dragged for no early review copies. GTA is protected by fans. It's hilarious. Yeah, I mean, I get that part, Wara, but I think to me it's less of a dragging it for no review. I don't know. It's like, we understand why, right, Rockstar is doing it. And I don't think Rockstar is doing it because the game's coming in hot. Any GTA is coming in hot. That's no secret, right? That's happening because the game is so ridiculously huge. There's going to be tons of bugs. I don't think that those bugs are endemic in the way that Bethesda games are. I don't really know how to describe it. There is something different about it. But I also don't think that they're hiding anything by not giving review codes. I think it's just a matter of, they don't want the leaks. And so, I don't know. I also think that whole thing of not putting out early review copies, it's becoming a little more selective, I think, now, in terms of people feeling that means that there's no confidence in the game. I want to say there was another game recently that didn't let out review codes yet, but I don't know. Brap, thanks so much for coming through the chat. The Game Award show is rigged. So true that GTA doesn't need it. I said similar with Hogwarts Legacy. People were complaining that it was snubbed, and I was like, massive sales are way better than some awards. IMO. Yeah. Although what I'm saying in this case is that GTA 6 is still going to get the awards. That's why I don't feel like everything needs to be broken to make way for it. Hero Down Under joins the chat. Thanks so much for coming through. And Real Innate in the chat also. Thanks so much for coming through, Nate. Let's move on and talk about, I think we're rolling up on the last news story. And yes, this is the coup de grace on the floor. So let me grab another drink before we get into Halo sales tanking. Warren says, well, I know people are changing their tone for GTA Online not having crossplay and cross progression, but they dragged in Night Rain for not having crossplay. Kind of funny, the double side. Yeah. And Warren, yes, I get that there's, I get that there's a double standard. GTA Online for not having crossplay and cross progression. Yeah. I'll just leave that alone. I don't play GTA Online. I never have. So, I'm sure that's out there. Halo sales tank, and we now know that Xbox doesn't care about the commercial success of Gears of War E-Day, or suspects it wouldn't have been anyway. So again, the news story that I have up in the background is just window dressing. GTA is protected. Yeah, I mean, what I will say where I agree with you, Wara, is, a lot of Sturm and Drang about like the $100 like collector's edition and the exclusive thing on Netflix and the code in a box and blah 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 blah, and and people saying things like the only reason Rockstar is charging $80 because they know they can get away with it. I'm like, look, if you guys don't get it that you glaze over a thing, right, every time it's mentioned, then don't get surprised when somebody does something based on a perception of ridiculously high demand. Like, we constantly talk about GTA being like the most in-demand thing in gaming, the most valuable franchise, like, and I think that even exceeds gaming. So kind of to me personally, and again, I'm not saying you're wrong for saying I'm not going to pay $80 or I'm not going to pay $100 or I'm not going to participate in something being paywalled or I'm not going to like, again, make your consumer choice. But if you don't understand that 2 + 2 = 4 and 2 + 3 = 5 and Rockstar plus gamers equals $80, then I don't know what to tell you. Like, but this demand has been burbling for years. People constantly talk about it. You constantly heap praise on top of GTA. Like, to me, don't be surprised when the crap comes out like at $80 and with all this stuff being handling it like a crown jewel, because it is the crown jewel, because you guys propped it up like the crown jewel. This is what I said about Bethesda games. Like, you guys keep letting Todd Howard get away with stuff over and over and over again, constantly glazing him when he comes out on the stage with the flight jacket on or the ledger or whatever it is. And then Fallout 76 comes out, he puts out an apology letter the day before it drops, basically saying, hey, this isn't the game that we told you it was going to be, but give us some grace and let us work on it. Like, don't be surprised by that, right? Like, this is what happens. I quite honestly, I don't necessarily understand the like, a company becomes the market leader and then they raise prices and people say, well, this is what you get from market leaders. Yeah, this is what you get from market leaders because they're the market leader, right? Because you have shown a demand level that's commensurate with them raising prices. Like, that is how basic economics works. I don't really understand. I don't get it. I don't get it. Like, again, this is because people have gotten this twisted perception that they have a relationship with companies, and that because you bought something from a company, that a company is supposed to be nice to you. That is not how things work. Actually, I went to an athletics meeting with a bunch of other parents in the room that I was like, I was hearing them ask the questions and make statements, and I'm like, can your kid buy a hamburger without me drawing a model-based diagram? Like, can they find their way to the bathroom at night? Like I don't get it. Like society has come to this point where they just think things are going to be given to them on a silver platter, and they don't understand that when massive radical demand for a thing at scale happens, then prices are going to rise. When a competitor wins out of, like, the signal that you're sending is that you like the thing better than the other thing. So the company says, hey, like, we said that, you know, people really like this when it was $70, so we're going to raise it to $80 because we think enough people like it, and the people who don't like it at $80 aren't significant enough to us that it negatively impacts our performance because of what I said before, because their primary responsibility is to return maximum investment on to shareholders. Like, and look, if you buy stock and you invest in companies, this is my problem with the hypocrisy too. If you buy stock and you invest in companies, if you buy Nintendo stock, you're probably asking the same questions that their shareholders are asking, which is, why are you not charging more money for the Nintendo Switch 2, given how many people have bought? Like, literally more people have bought it than you projected were going to buy it in their first year. So why are you still selling it for $450? And look, this is not a matter of whether you like it or not. This is not a matter of whether you're anti-capitalist. This is not a matter of whether or not you think it's fair. This is not a matter of whether or not you think this is not a matter of whether, like, you know, everybody's, you know, an evil, greedy corporate. Like, I do not care. Like, I'm simply saying, acknowledge reality of the way flipping things work. You want to be cranky and salty about it, that's fine. But, like, the continuing desire to bury your head in the sand and act like things are not the way they are. You act like because the vice president goes to church on Sunday that he or she is going to come into the office and slash a price is just madness. Like, I don't get it. Like, it's seriously flown the coop. Right? Like, it has seriously just become this completely decoupled, fantastical, utopian. Like, it's like people think we're living in the Federation, right? And we have this universal basic income, and we have replicators, and like, food is just produced just because you speak a verbal command. We're not there yet, folks. Like, we still live in a capitalist economy. It's not a Marxist economy. It's not a socialist economy. It's not a communist economy. It's a capitalist economy. Adam Smith told us how this works in 1776, and it still works the same way. And those laws still apply to gaming. They don't change just because it's gaming. Gaming doesn't live on an island. Like, I love talking about games. I understand that some people feel disenfranchised. I absolutely understand that some people are being priced out. I've tried to explain that to people, like, for years. And I've tried to explain to you why you're being priced out, because of what I said earlier, because the upper income bands, at least in the United States, are increasing in comparison to the middle class. So yeah, there's a chance that the middle class is going to get squeezed out of gaming, at least in terms of the high-end gaming and the way that we've been participating in gaming, you know, for a lot of you guys for the last 20 years, because you weren't around, right, for the earlier years. Like, those are the things that are changing. Those are the things that are objective. Those are the things that are realistic. Those are things that are pragmatic. And the problem is, if you're talking to people holding church sermons and people who are professing to you to feel good about yourself because you're a good human being and you should be rewarded with cheap prices, that's not how the world works. So continue listening to the people that try to explain to you, right, other things other than reality. And then that's why you're going to have a very difficult time comprehending and understanding why these decisions are happening, while the landscape is changing, while the ground is shifting out underneath you, because you've chosen to believe that E doesn't actually equal MC squared, like Einstein tried to tell you that it equals something else. But, like, if you insist on believing in that non-reality, like, you can't be helped, and you're gonna be misled. You're gonna be duped. You're gonna be, like, left, right, with an inability to cope. It's super funny, right, that we throw this term around on social media, copium, right? And I admit, like, the term as it's stated is actually, it's being used correctly, right? But the fact of the matter is that people actually have lost, right, basic coping mechanisms, it seems like, in our current society. Like, they don't get it. Like, if you're being priced out of gaming, I hate to tell you, but the answer to your problem is to go find another hobby, right? Or choose some of the avenues that are available in gaming where it's less expensive for you to go to participate in gaming. But this belief, and again, I think to a certain extent the companies did this to themselves by holding prices flat for the 20 years that they did, instead of allowing them to naturally increase as they would have and should have in accordance with like the capitalist economy and what was going on at the time. So they did themselves their own disservice, and which is why I think they're getting some of this rubber band effect, right? But the reality is if you're being priced out, yelling and screaming about it isn't going to change that. What's going to change it is you making a decision and you doing some analysis and assessment of the other things that are on offering on the market. Like I don't like, and when I talk about normally adjusted, right, people who are not normally adjusted kick and scream. This is why we say children throw temper tantrums, right? Because they're contending with environments that they don't have control of. They don't understand those environments. I try and tell children you're not making, like you're making decisions as if you have like control, and you're gonna learn a harsh lesson, right? Because you're not making good choices right now. Like being angry because of something that I said, right? And instead of complying with what I said, lashing out isn't actually going to have the result that you think it's going to have. And this is the same thing, like yelling and screaming and kicking and barricading yourself in a digital room and trying to hold PlayStation hostage on social media. That's actually not going to have the effect that you think that it's going to have, right? You're not blockading the Strait of Hormuz. That's what some of you guys think, unfortunately. And I'm not just picking on the physical people, because it extrapolates to tons of other stuff, right? You think you're going to hold a naval blockade and hold a corporation hostage? And I'm like, and again, the reality now, I am going to pick on the physical. Like, a lot of people say, like, PlayStation is ending physical media. PlayStation is making their choice. First of all, PlayStation is not the entire industry. The fact that PlayStation is stopping selling discs doesn't mean that, like, there's no more physical. Like, there's physical. You can go find it. You can go buy it. You may have to make choices that you don't like, because that choice may be you not playing on PlayStation. But those things are potentially available. And if they stop becoming available, like I hated when physical keyboards went away. I was a huge BlackBerry stan, but physical keyboards became unavailable. But the difference is that I acknowledge why physical keyboards became available, because 92% of the market wasn't buying them. And so you can quibble about the percentage, right? It's 70%, it's 80%, it's actually 52%. They're making it whatever. Like, I don't know what to tell you. But if the revenue is being driven by 80% of the money, if 80% of the money is being driven by digital, that's going to mean a thing. Companies are going to make choices, particularly when the landscape shifts and moves out from underneath them. Now, I will say, like, Sony of old, not PlayStation, Sony of old. What Sony of old would have done would have been, quite honestly, it would have continued producing physical. 20 years ago, Sony would have continued producing physical, and they would have continued producing physical until that business in its entirety just dried up and nobody was buying it. So it's actually interesting from a case study perspective and a business study perspective that this is the thing that I've been talking about Sony and about PlayStation, which is that in past history, they have just, right, chosen a horse. That horse has become successful, and they have ridden that horse into the ground until there's just no blood left from it. We talked about this in the Discord the other day. Like, Sony rode TVs and were part of the cohort that tried to make 3D TVs a thing. And then nobody bought it. And then their television business dried up. And it's part of the reason they pivoted to PlayStation. Sony used to make 6 to 8 different models of the Xperia until nobody was buying Xperia handsets. And they had to pivot to PlayStation. Sony used to make Vio PCs until nobody was buying Vio PCs. All these businesses, and Sony would not listen until those things dried up and they literally were forced to pivot and to stop businesses and to move it. Like, that used to be what old Sony used to do. So it's kind of interesting that, like, we're living in this time. Again, I'm not saying that it makes you happy. I'm simply saying this from a business perspective and a business study perspective as a case study. It's super interesting that we're living in a time where Sony seems to be actually showing forethought in a belief that the trajectory that its business has followed for the last decade is not going to continue to be that same trajectory, and is figuring out things, or trying things at least, that they may need to do to shift it. So I'm not saying you should be happy about it. I'm just commenting that that's, I think, what's going on. Warwar, I'm way too busy in my life to stay mad. So they're going to change their mind. They're just waiting for a state of play to say it. Josh Ayers, there's free games you can enjoy. Brap, gaming is bound by the laws of economics, and people constantly talk about the industry as if those laws somehow don't apply. I just want to say that grew into a rant over the Ark. The rant was not, the impetus of that rant was not the physical versus digital thing, right? That's maybe where I landed and where I talked about, just because that's what's in the zeitgeist right now, but it's not really where it started. Where it really started is that people complain about a lot of things, including increased prices. People need to make choices about things, and they need to understand that those things are going to happen because of the laws of economics. They're not going to change just because you're mad. I'm gonna try Apple Arcade. Yeah, and here it is. I'm not with you, but I understand it. I've commented. I mean, I spent my time in Apple Arcade. I've commented that. In fact, I'm on my Mac Mini M4 right now. One of the things I've commented on is NBA 2K6 is on Apple Arcade, and it plays to fairly high fidelity. Not the same as you'll play it on a PlayStation 5. Not the same as you'll play it on a PC. But it's absolutely serviceable, particularly for a game that, like, I think there are a lot of people who will play a basketball game who don't really, like, they're not really playing the basketball game to have, like, the ultimate premium experience. So things like that being available for people as prices rise, right, I think are going to, cause people to follow other outlets. In my opinion, the price out of gaming is a social media gamer problem, in the sense that it's actually a case of keeping up with the Joneses because they're trying to keep up with it. Yes. And I think that's unfortunate in terms of, like, the language of our society that we have crept away from. The term keeping up with the Joneses doesn't get thrown around anymore because I think everybody kind of has this expectation to keep up with the Joneses, right? There's a certain amount of entitlement that I think goes on and people, like, don't recognize. I've been trying to explain, Brap knows I've been trying to explain since I was on his show. I tried to tell people when prices started rising, I said, you need to understand that there are people who are not as price sensitive as you. That there are some people who are going to see those rising prices and they're going to continue to consume because they can afford to, because they don't feel that the negative impact impacts their quality of life, right, in the same way that it may for you. And so you may have to make choices that other people don't have to make. That's just the way economy works. I'm not saying anybody's not deserving. I'm not saying, rich people deserve to be more happy. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, look, if I wanted to, I could afford a Tesla, but like, buying a Tesla would be painful, right? In terms of, like, the other things that I want to spend money on. So I choose to not buy a Tesla. I don't yell and scream at Elon Musk to make Teslas more affordable, even though I feel that they should be. And I feel that the way that they should be made affordable is a political thing. And so I vote, right, based on, right, hoping that I'm voting people into office who will create bigger subsidies for EVs. Because I think that's the only way that it will happen. So, I don't know. Bespoke says games should probably be $150 each by now. It would be accepted if pricing had gone up every gen like it should have. Yeah. Yeah, Hero, and that's my point. Like, what part of my point is, my buying habits changed, and some of that changed out of personal life choice, but also out of necessity, right? Because the way that I used to purchase vehicles no longer became a fit. And part of that was due to rising prices. Part of that was due to my own life choice. But there were options on the market for me to pursue. And that's also part of my huge problem. And now I will talk about my value system and belief system is I have a very, very strong negative reaction to humans who act like they're helpless. That just drives me nuts. I really can't stand it. And so when the dialogue on social media is about how people are helpless and how they're being forced and how, like, they seem to have an inability to think their way out of a freaking paper bag and make a damn decision, that does make me angry. Real Nate, we're in the wave of variable pricing. Everyone's games can't sell for the same price, the same way it is for cars and trucks and every other good with different qualities. Yeah. Okay, so let me take another drink and then we will finally get to the last story. Sorry. Okay, again, Halo sales tank, and we know that Xbox doesn't care about the commercial success of Gears of War E-Day, or suspects it wouldn't have been anyway. Halo Campaign Evolved is not a good commercial launch for a franchise that was once synonymous with Xbox. Current estimates put the game at roughly 1.2 million paid copies for its first couple of weeks. I mean, those are my estimates. I have been working on models to allow me to calculate and project expected sales for games. Part of the reason I've done this is because I've been absolutely convinced that Alinea Analytics is full of crap. And nothing they're doing is super complex and can easily be replicated. And I will get my models to a point where they are more accurate than theirs. If they can tout themselves as coming up with whatever crap it is that they're peddling, I am establishing and proving that I have the same capability. So my estimates put Halo Campaign Evolved sales at somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 million paid copies. So that has remained fairly consistent from the data that I've seen. All right, current estimates put the game. My estimates put the game at roughly 1.2 to 1.5 million paid copies after its first few weeks. I think we're pressing on like a month, heading towards a month now. A result that is especially difficult to characterize as successful, given that this was supposed to be Microsoft's opportunity to introduce Halo to millions of PlayStation players. The game was deliberately brought to PS5 as part of the broader Xbox strategy of putting legacy franchises on competing platforms, presumably to cultivate new audiences for whatever comes next. Instead, only about 2% of the PlayStation 5 audience engaged with it in the launch window. According to Matt Piscatel's engagement data, while the game has generated considerably stronger engagement on Xbox. That tells me this isn't fundamentally a PlayStation problem, it is a problem with Halo itself. Xbox can put the game on the platform with the largest addressable console audience, but that doesn't make the franchise relevant to that audience. Halo once had that kind of gravitational pull, it doesn't anymore. Brap, I hope you were around to hear this. What makes this more troubling for Xbox is that there isn't even an obvious Game Pass success story to fall back on. Microsoft's strategy has increasingly been built around the idea that a game doesn't necessarily have to sell millions of copies if it can instead generate enormous engagement through Game Pass. But when Xbox has a genuine engagement phenomena, it generally tells us about it. Huge player milestones become a part of the company's marketing narrative. We haven't seen that kind of celebration around Campaign Evolved, and that's important because Game Pass is now the primary way Xbox can reach players without asking them to purchase the game outright. Campaign Evolved is available through Game Pass, while also being sold on Steam and PS5. So if the game isn't producing a compelling paid sales story, it isn't producing a compelling public Game Pass engagement story, what exactly is the commercial success case? The answer appears to be that there isn't one. Not because Game Pass is inherently unsuccessful, although it is, but because this particular game hasn't generated the kind of demand that would make their model particularly impressive. So again, I don't take that as me heaping praise upon Game Pass. Game Pass is a problem, and it has been a problem forever and a day. But the true story here is about the lackluster performance of Halo. It can be true that two things are performing badly. And so that puts Xbox in an increasingly ugly strategic position. When Microsoft kept its games exclusive, Xbox hardware sales continued to trail PlayStation by a wide margin, and Game Pass didn't produce the transformation Microsoft had hoped for. So Microsoft expanded its audience by putting major franchises on PlayStation. But now we're seeing that simply putting an Xbox game on PlayStation doesn't guarantee that PlayStation owners will buy it. The novelty of buying an Xbox game on a PlayStation has worn off. There was a period when every Xbox release on PS5 felt historically significant, people wanted to participate in the novelty, and some PlayStation players enjoyed the opportunity to symbolically twist the knife in the console war. That novelty is gone. We're back to the thing that has always determined whether a game succeeds. Is it actually a great game that people want to play? Halo's current problem is that Xbox continues to treat the franchise as though its legacy itself is a commercial proposition. It isn't. The market has moved on, and the things Halo once pioneered have been done repeatedly, and often better by other games. That's why Gears of War E-Day is so interesting. Microsoft has decided to keep E-Day exclusive, ostensibly reinforcing the value of Xbox hardware and honoring the franchise's legacy audience. But look at the behavior rather than the messaging. I want to foot stomp this because this is a theme that I've been on since Asha Sharma came to power. I'm going to repeat it. I'm probably going to repeat it 3 times. There are things that Xbox executives say and that Asha Sharma says, and then there is what they actually do. And what they're actually doing. Shaq News just wrote a news story that said a very similar thing. What they actually do, the behavior that they actually have, the deliveries that they actually make, the actions that they take, often speak 180 degrees out from what they are saying. And that's not even to talk about the executives who say things that are 180 out. Like when Matthew Ball says, "Oh, we're going hard in the paint on exclusives," and then Matt Booty turns around and says, "Well, Xbox players shouldn't expect every single player game to be exclusive to Xbox. Don't think that this is just a matter of like single player games versus multiplayer games. Some single player games are going to go multi-platform." Madness. But again, I want to reinforce, look at the behavior rather than the messaging. Stop following the waving hands and the painted on smile and the tap dancing, right? Pay attention to what they are actually doing. This weekend's E-Day beta is competing for the attention of a shooter audience that substantially overlaps with Call of Duty. While Activision, which Microsoft owns, is running a double XP weekend for Call of Duty at precisely the same time. Right? Everybody, Call of Duty right now has a double XP weekend going 2 months before the new Call of Duty comes out, when Call of Duty players are heavily engaged in the grind to max level and complete all their stuff to hit prestige, right before the new Call of Duty comes out. And Activision is running a double XP weekend. Double XP weekend is normally a thing that Activision has historically weaponized, right, to nosedive other games that have been running beta weekends, right? Like other competitor games have run beta weekends, and lo and behold, if you look back, you will find that Call of Duty that weekend ran a double XP weekend. I know because I play Call of Duty heavy. And every time I go in and I see it's a double XP weekend, not every time, but whenever I know there's a beta going on and I go in and I see the double, I'm like, oh, these mofos, and I laugh. Right? Because I'm also playing the double XP weekend. I'm not playing that beta because Hamp doesn't play betas, but that's a different point, right? The point is that in the past, they have definitely deliberately used double XP in an effort to tank a competitor's beta weekend. That is happening right now, and it is happening to a game that is also owned by Xbox. I just don't get it. The buffoonery and the mismanagement are God tier. That's particularly consequential because Call of Duty is approaching the end of its annual cycle when players have an incentive to grind levels, weapons, and prestige before the next game arrives. Not so much the weapons, because like if you get a weapon unlocked, then who cares because you're moving on. But there are definitely people who are vested in their online digital persona and their competitiveness and want to be able to say, before the new game came out, I hit prestige, whatever. Prestige Master, I hit Prestige Master 100, whatever. And the clock is running. Meanwhile, E-Day is supposed to be using its beta to generate enthusiasm and convert players into customers. I don't think we can prove from that scheduling decision alone that Microsoft's executives intend, but it is an extraordinary piece of evidence when you put it alongside the weak performance of Gears of War Reloaded on PlayStation and Microsoft's subsequent decision to keep E-Day exclusive. It raises a very reasonable hypothesis. Either Xbox doesn't believe E-Day needs to be commercially successful, or already suspects that it won't be. The beta's actual player numbers will give us another important data point, if we actually hear that from Xbox. Hopefully somebody will be able to estimate it and will let us know. And that's ultimately the problem with Xbox's current strategy. Microsoft keeps changing the commercial vector without addressing the underlying creative problem. Again, as I go through this last paragraph, this is another thing that I want to foot stomp. I've said it a couple times. I've said it a couple times kind of lightly, but I want to super emphasize this. Exclusive games didn't sell enough Xbox hardware. So this is part of the problem, part of the thing that caused me to crash out. Like this argument that like going back to exclusive will make you guys did exclusives before. And you did exclusives before Game Pass. When you were doing exclusives before Game Pass, the console was outsold 2-1. When you did exclusives with Game Pass, the console got outsold 3-1. So how in the world, again, what is the definition of crazy? Somebody who like repeats the same actions over and over again and expects different outcomes. How do you expect to execute on the same actions that were done previously and have different outcomes than the last two times? Again, I don't get it. Exclusive games didn't sell enough Xbox hardware. Game Pass didn't produce the subscriber growth Microsoft wanted. Publishing games on PlayStation isn't automatically producing blockbuster software sales. And now the company is doubling down on a relatively small collection of legacy tentpole franchises while simultaneously cutting thousands of jobs and reducing the number of studios capable of making new games. Until Xbox starts making great games, not merely competent, solid, or technically impressive games, but games that become the things the rest of the industry wants to chase, it doesn't matter which distribution strategy it chooses. The turnaround isn't going to come from another permutation of exclusives, multi-platform releases, and subscriptions. Xbox needs to do something it has historically been unwilling to do: invest in new creative leadership and new sources of talent. That could mean looking beyond the Western studios it has spent decades acquiring and investing seriously in Japan, Korea, China, and the broader Asia-Pacific development ecosystem, where some of the industry's most interesting emerging talent is coming from. The question for Xbox isn't whether it can find another way to sell Halo or Gears. It's whether it is finally willing to do something it hasn't done before. What Xbox is saying to you is that we are going to continue doing what we, again, like super funny, exhibiting the same behavior that Sony at the corporate level used to do before, right? We did a thing, except in this case, like Xbox actually wasn't successful doing those things before the last two generations. They were successful back in the 360 generation. But they're telling you that we're going to execute on things that we have executed on before that weren't successful, but somehow, miraculously, because Asha Sharma's in charge, this time it's going to work. I don't, what? I don't get it, and I don't, and I also don't get the bullishness and like the hyper confidence, like that. I don't get it. People act like they never sold exclusives before. That's the thing that's like crazy to me. People are like, they did, like people are like, they put out games without the marketing. I'm like, are you saying Xbox has never marketed before? No, they marketed before, right? Like all the things that the fans talk about now they've been doing poorly. It's not, over the last few years when I was already telling them that they were doing them poorly, right? It's not like they haven't tried these things before. They've tried exclusives. They've done exclusives before. They've done subscription services before, right? My whole point of this whole thing is that they've done exclusives before. They didn't arrive at parity. They did a subscription service because they couldn't arrive at parity with exclusives. They've moved backwards on subscriber numbers. They were at 34 million. They're now down at 30. They're down at 30 million after playing their biggest poker chip that they had, right? Firing their biggest arrow that they had in the quiver by putting Call of Duty in the subscription service, and it didn't move the needle on subscribers. It actually moved it backwards. I'm not putting the causality on it. Other things were causing them to move backwards, but it didn't save them. So now the thought is by going back to exclusive, which again, I remind people they did exclusive before, somehow that's going to make people invest in the hardware. But the company has also said they're not doing all exclusives. They're still putting some of those games over on PlayStation, but now we're seeing that the games aren't selling on PlayStation. So my whole point of this, and I wrote an article recently called, actually, I need to try and find it. I'm bringing it up on screen so at least people see the title. Rounding off Infinity, 10 keyless. Xbox's FY27 turnaround doesn't pass the smell test, right? Because everything that they're doing now, they have done before. It's not like it's new. It's not like they weren't doing it before. They've done it before, and it didn't work. And now by doing it again... Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot the one Delta. Oh, the Xbox is in all capital letters now. That's the thing that's going to make the outcome differently. Like, they've done all these things before, and now this is supposed to result in a net turnaround in 12 months. None of that makes any sense. And if you believe that, like, you are seriously believing in a bunch of smoke and mirrors because there's no substance underneath it. There's no objectivity. You want to talk about copium and hopium? Like, this is literally vaporware. We're gonna increase the price of the console. We're gonna keep some of the games exclusive, but make some of the games multi-platform. The exclusive games aren't selling, the subscription service isn't selling, and the multi-platform games aren't selling. And the hardware's not selling, but somehow we're gonna turn things around in 12 months. I can't imagine a situation, other than in politics, I can't imagine a situation where people are told a thing with zero substance underneath it and they all buy it wholesale, religiously, without asking any questions. Like literally, and this is the other thing that's frustrating. She shows up for these interviews and no one asks these hard questions. No one's asked the questions that I've just asked right now. No one has said, talk to me about your production pipeline, please. No one has had her on an interview and said, look, you say you're going to focus on Wolfenstein and Doom, but you just took a significant cut to id Software. You say you're going to double down on on Elder Scrolls and Fallout, but you took a huge schwack to Bethesda. That game was already targeted for 2028. And Bethesda is historically bad. They historically miss every advertised date or date that they thought they were going to hit something. So that means 2028 is really 2029. And then you significantly hobbled the studio and their productivity. So that means that's a 2030 game. So please talk to me and explain to me how, if this game comes out in 2030, how's that figure into your strategy with Project Helix? And how does that figure into your strategy for stabilizing the Xbox Series hardware, which you said is one of your goals and objectives? But you've crippled your production pipeline to the point where they're not putting out anything new in 2028 and 2029 once we get beyond Clockwork Revolution, other than remasters. Can you talk me through that? Have you figured that out yet? Has Matt Booty figured that out? None of these so-called journalists or interviewers who have any clue about software development, project management, P&L, none of them are asking these types of questions, but they're all wholesale believing in this mockery and this charade of political platforming about what the future looks like. And they all want you to believe them, is the other thing that's crazy. So, I don't know. I think I can rest my case. Warwana says, don't listen to what someone says, watch what they do is always true. Josh Ayers, Asha has made more TVs use xCloud, but that's Sarah Bond's strategy that Xbox hated. Yeah, Josh, and that's what their SEC 10K says, by the way. Their SEC 10K says what Phil and Sarah Bond were saying. It doesn't say what Asha's been saying. And it was changed from what it said in 2025. So they put in the effort to change what the SEC 10K says for this reporting year, and it speaks to something different than they are putting out in marketing and PR. And so one of my assessments is that, like, if you were going to put the effort into changing the SEC 10K, knowing that you were going to make this regime change, wouldn't you have taken that level of effort to make the SEC 10K match with what you claim you're executing? Unless what you're saying in PR isn't what you're actually executing, unless what you say, what you're actually executing is what the SEC 10K says, which should be the legally binding requirement, because that's what you're actually sending to, right, the SEC to show what you're advertising to investors. And interestingly enough, one of the things that the SEC 10K says for 2026 that changes from 2025 is an increased focus on, say, Xbox Cloud gaming, for instance, which, oh, by the way, matches with what they've actually executed by rolling it out to more televisions. So, again, watch the bouncing ball, stop watching the sleight of hand. Don't listen to what someone says. I already read that. I suspect Xbox AP just doesn't have the power anymore. Real Nate facts. Thanks, Nate, for agreeing. Josh says, is 2027 still the year they need a turnaround, or are they in trouble? I don't necessarily. And so I'm also not saying, hey, if they don't turn around in 2027, like the jig is up. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, don't tell people you're going to turn around in FY27 when it's mathematically and quantifiably impossible, unless you do cook the books. right? Unless you do say, hey, we're at 3% profit margin. This year we're at 3.1. That's the return to growth that I've been talking about. Like, you know. Xbox needs to actually make an IP. In the history of the company, they bought 99% of the IPs they own. I bet Gears of War E-Day comes to PlayStation next year. Where one says, I make sure to type Xbox and capitals to take the piss. Josh Ayers, they had that June show to sell studios. People should be outraged beyond belief. No one has ever done that. Yeah, no, I don't disagree, Josh. Josh Ayers says, I doubt Xbox make it to 2030. Bespoke says, Bespoke, by the way, thanks so much for showing up in the chat. I find it hilarious that not a single journalist has asked if Xbox plans to support new physical games for Helix. They seem to be much more content simply blaming Sony while Xbox sits in its house, or just repeating rumors. Like, John Linneman says, hey, I heard from a couple of people that Xbox may consider continuing to support physical. And like, everybody's off to the races that Xbox is still doing physical next time around. And I mean, I commented to Brap when I talked about this, like, and people attribute it to, well, they're going to do that because they're taking a stab at Sony. Xbox is part of Microsoft, and their leadership comes from the Microsoft culture. One of the things that is ingrained in Microsoft culture, and again, I go back to if you've been studying them at the corporate level for the last 20 years or more, one of the things that's ingrained in Microsoft culture, which they continuously say, is that we are not like other companies. We cannot unburden ourselves or decouple ourselves from the burden of maintaining legacy. And so so my big comparator that I always draw is Apple and Microsoft. Apple just tells you, like, hey, when Tahoe rolls out, these MacBooks are not supported. And Apple has no sympathy about it. Like, this is it. Like, your hardware is at end of life, right? You can either continue using what you use or you can upgrade, right? Microsoft can't say that. Microsoft feels, and this is not what I'm saying. This is what Microsoft says about itself. Microsoft can't say, even though they have done it like onesie twosie here and there. Like there are some Intel processors that they say like aren't supported. Like, and they did a whole thing. This is part of the reason why they got all the backlash about Windows 11, because when Windows 11 came along and said you had to have a TPU to support it, people got really angry. And you also notice that got walked back, and suddenly there became software and emulation ways to replicate the functionality of a TPU at the firmware level, and that allowed your PC to become compliant with Windows 11 and to install Windows 11. Microsoft is endemically, culturally, institutionally bound in its own psyche and mind that it can't abandon legacy. That's why backward compatibility became such a big thing for Xbox. That was a flow down from the Microsoft culture. I'm not saying Microsoft told them to do it, or unfortunately, I'm saying that because their leadership comes from Microsoft, that is a thing that is ingrained in part of their culture, and so it's natural for Xbox to take that route. And it may see that as a competitive differentiator, but if Microsoft remains back, like the whole reason Microsoft is doing this like digital to this digital conversion, the reason why they may have some legacy, right? The reason why they are putting backwards compatible PC games or Xbox games on PC is because it's woven into their being that they cannot abandon the legacy, that they always have to remain, right? I always have to retain that tunnel back to it. But I'd say from a competitive perspective also, let's look at what would happen to the Xbox business if you told the diehards, which is the only people that they're talking to. This is the other thing that I always have a problem with Xbox. For all of the Sturm and Drang that Xbox needs to attract new customers, they never talk to new customers. They always talk to the same customers that they already have and that who aren't leaving. They always, they talk about this thing about exclusives is to satisfy, right, to honor the legacy of people who have it. Like they're doing it for the diehards. Actually, so the diehards have something to talk about. So imagine what would happen to their business if they completely abandon, like that is the only thing that is helping them hold on by a pinky now, which again is the stark contrast to the PlayStation business, right? In the PlayStation business, it's not that legacy that's enabling them to be the market leader. The Xbox businesses, that's the only reason they're still in the game. So the optics and the strategy and the imperative, the business imperatives become radically different. But Xbox doing disc to digital, and I don't think Project Helix will have the disk drive by any means. If anything, well, if they're smart, they'll do the thing that I say PlayStation should do, which is they should just enable the ability for an external USB Blu-ray drive to connect and to be recognized and to have the drivers to accommodate that external thing. And then, if people have physical discs to install media that way. But again, I think any notion of what Xbox is doing in terms of backwards compatibility and physical isn't because they're championing and like this is always the thing that like people say, oh well, Xbox is doing this because they're the good guy. They're not being altruistic. No, they're not doing it because they're the good guy. They're doing it for business reasons that are tightly woven into their culture, and they do this for everything, right? So this is why Xbox didn't just say, well, your apps all have to be 64-bit now. Right, they came up with UWP, and they've continued to workarounds so that people's legacy applications continue to work on Windows because they can't abandon the legacy. They don't do it because they're the good guy. They do it because that is what their business is built on. Right? Stop trying to evangelize these guys as like popes or deacon, what I don't know what the Catholic structure is like. But you guys all act like these guys are like bishops, like who live in the Vatican. Right, and they do this so they don't have to come into work the next day and do 50 Hail Marys. No, that's not why they're doing it. They're doing it to make money. Right? They're doing it because they're trying to compete. They're doing it because they failed to compete in other business areas, right, or via other business strategies, and they're doing it because they're trying to stay in the game, at least for some period of time. So I don't know. Yeah, is anyone playing those old games, back Xbox games? C Fresh, thanks so much for coming through the chat. Yeah, C Fresh, I will say, I had the same reaction, and my reaction was driven by, oh, that's just what I want, is a bunch of games locked at 720p and 1080i showing up in my game room where I've just converted all my monitors to 4K OLEDs, right? But actually, they are doing some interesting technological tricks to have those games render at the actual resolution of your display. I'm not sure how far they up-res them, but there are games that have some wrapper around them that's taking inputs from the engine and then multiplying the rendering pipeline by like 4 times. So you're getting up-res. That up-res will sometimes cause a low resolution texture to be stretched across a wireframe that has more vertices and points, so it just looks like a really low res texture across a 4K image. So I don't know how well that's doing, but yeah. But I would say more so, C-Fresh, it's not to me necessarily the graphical performance, or graphical or image quality. It's more so this, and this is what we just talked about with Halo. Like my disinterest in Halo is I don't need to replay Halo. And I suspect a lot of people have already replayed Halo, Campaign Evolved, whatever. I know Campaign Evolved is new content, whatever, but Combat Evolved, people have already played Combat Evolved dozens of times. And the need for somebody to do it again for $50, I just don't think that that's a huge demand signal on the market for that. So when I go back and I look at these games and the games that they're porting over, and it's I'm sorry, I play older games, absolutely. But I also have a threshold, and more so generally it's kind of around 10 years. Once a game is beyond a 10-year window, I don't know how much I'm going back and replaying games that are pre-2016 games ish. And so there's a conversation that if you put these games out and you put them on stores for $5, then you won't be leaving money on the table. You'll be able to monetize. And again, I'm I said this in the Discord. I'm yes, some money is not no money, but by the same token is, little money doesn't mean as much as big money. And small money doesn't move the needle, right? PlayStation was making $500 million a year by putting its games over on PC. That clearly like didn't move the needle enough for them. I'm gonna pick on the physical versus digital conversation again. Everybody comes up with this, oh, they still make vinyl records. The vinyl records are over $1 billion. I'm like, first of all, please stop acting like you can go buy any record, right? Like, that you can buy any new record, right? You can buy the latest, EP from like pick your favorite artist down at Tower Records on vinyl. That's not where we are. Yes. Vinyl, after like 15 years of making a comeback, finally eclipsed $1 billion. So that's a thing. But please stop acting like every track that you can find on Spotify is available down at Best Buy, right in the music section on vinyl. No, that's a ridiculous extrapolation. That's not where we are. Like there's a trendy thing that's going on. It's not an industry comeback. Please stop acting like that. That's, like I said, that's a ridiculous take, ridiculous postulate. So yeah, vinyl records are on the up and up. Yeah, I don't know, man. Okay, let's see. John, I think he's talking about Aluminum. Bespoke says, John sources Goat Gaming, that I am Cloudman on Twitter. When I was a Digital Foundry supporter on Patreon, he said on the Discord that was who told Digital Foundry that PlayStation had a secret deal for Black Myth. Yeah, great. I think PS6 will use the PS5 drive. Yeah, that'd be interesting. I don't even know what the PS5 drive looks like or how it connects. So yeah, that would be interesting if it supports that. Yeah, no, Bespoke says, I think the reason Xbox is bringing the backwards compatible to PC and why they have to play anywhere is because they're trying to move your Xbox library to PC so they can shut down Xbox and just be Windows gaming. There's lots of that. Yeah, I mean, yes, the backwards compatibility games on PC, to me, it's again, I'd say watch what people do, not what they say. And yes, I agree that move seems to be a thing that would lead to trying to move their user base to PC. Hero Down says, I just found Halo CE to be technically sound, but nothing new. It feels dated. I do agree. Warwana says, it's legit like Mean Girls. Stop trying to make fetch happen, Gretchen. And how many vinyl record collectors are actually playing them? Warwana says, I saw it's 80% collectors, hoping they keep going up in value. Yeah, I mean, and like I hate to say it again, I'm not throwing shade, but I think a lot of those people who are buying vinyl records also listen to digital, and like Warwana says, I don't know that they're all listening. I don't know. I don't even know that the argument like is that big a deal. I agree with you, Wara. But yeah, there are things happening. Like I can't, everybody's got to determine a way to contend with the reality. But like I said, no hate. I don't hate people for taking the positions. Where I have a problem is I say the word PlayStation and you're immediately down my throat about physical versus digital. I also want to say, and I'll go back and I'll maybe finish up with this rant. When I talk about like people being well adjusted and people being, being passionate versus being obsessed, getting at a third-party independent developer who is not part of PlayStation, who is just putting their game out on PlayStation and acting like they don't have a right to market their game or talk about their game on social media because you're focused on physical and you're right again, you're conducting siege warfare, right? And trying to encircle their castle and tell them they can't come out unless they put their game on physical. That is obsession. That is not being passionate. That is not being well adjusted. Right? That is taking an approach of not, commensurate response in terms of warfare, right? And you've expanded the battlefield, right, to innocent bystanders. That's not being well adjusted. That's not normal. That is not appropriately processing your grief. And in my opinion, and I'll just say it quite frankly, that is not about a love for video games as far as I'm concerned. Like, when you lose the rationality to, ascribe a thing to, causality to a thing, and lose the ability to differentiate targets and understand that some people are behind this thing that you think is nefarious and some people are not. Some people are not involved with it. Some people are just other symbiotic participants in the ecosystem. That loss of objectivity, that is obsession, not passion. And that's where that's where you've lost the plot as far as I'm concerned. Okay. If it was close to April, then I would love somebody to troll with final versions of PS5 games being released. It would be hilarious. Whereas I used to read comments to check how lukewarm the audience was on a game trailer, but now it's all like the crow screaming meme where it's physical and disc convos. You can't lose the plot. Developers out here catching strays. Right, exactly. Yeah, it's like drive-bys, right? It's like you got shot just because you were at the skating rink, not because you did anything wrong, but just because you were at the skating rink, right? And that's just not cool, man. It's just not it. All right, everybody, thanks so much for coming by. Like I said, I knew this was going to be a longer episode. That's also why I had to keep moving it, and I wound up getting on very late. I appreciate you. Thanks so much for everybody who came by and swung through the live stream. For anybody who watches the archive version of this on the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, I appreciate you as well. Please feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel. So you can receive a notification whenever I post new content. Thanks to Warwater for mentioning a great show. And the last thing we want is devs losing passion because of a few bad eggs. Yeah, I've said, I really don't understand how devs do it or why they keep doing it. And particularly devs who participate on social media. I don't just the ungrateful, people who don't appreciate the things that they supposedly claim to, people making things that they claim to love. I don't get. One thing I will ask, I don't often ask for comments. You don't have to put this on the YouTube channel. This is not about me trying to drive traffic to the YouTube channel. Many of you guys know me on Discord and can message me that way. I have been reluctant and resistant to trying to do this show at any type of regular time during the week. I just don't feel like the conversation here is that kind of conversation where it needs to be at a fixed time each week. But I will say, in trying to prepare for this show, because I had 2 or 3 major hypotheses that I wanted to get through, I did have to keep constantly moving this, which I also realized to a certain extent, for people who are paying attention to the YouTube page and stuff, that might be disruptive. For people who give a shit, right? So my point is, my belief up until this point is that nobody really gives a shit. But if you think it is helpful and preferential for me to figure out a fixed time to do this as much as feasible during the week, let me know. You can post a comment on YouTube if you don't know how to get in touch with me that way. But if you know me on Discord, you can just shoot me a DM and let me know. Again, this is not a request and an effort to drive traffic, but I have been interested in whether or not people are getting to a point where it would be more convenient for them if this happened at a regular time, which is still, I'm not going to guarantee that I would. That's still difficult for me to do just with my workflow and the way I put this show together. But I'm kind of interested in hearing that feedback. You happy with DMs game watching? Never mind. I won't use that term. But okay. All right. Thanks so much for everybody who came through. I appreciate you. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Stay safe out there. Play the games that you like and come here to talk to me about the games that you love. Once again, my name is Big Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. Until next time, good night, good luck, and good gaming. That's going to do it for me. I'm out of here.